Welcome to The Cow Behind the Barn, podcast exploring humanity, the world, and the divine as experienced and interpreted by an artist. I'm Kevin Caldwell, a co-founder of the Table Collective. I want to begin this episode by sharing two experiences. Experience one, I would call the agony, the cruelty, and the question of empathy. I've been allowing myself to feel the brutality, the blood, the raw, jagged edges of the cosmos. Tennyson was right. Nature is indeed red in tooth and claw. The universe is cruel and ruthless. Animals devour each other with bloody faces. When we strip away our clinical scientific verbiage, survival of the fittest is the evolutionary process of nature plowing over species that can't cut it, grinding them into the dust of extinction like a vast genetic glacier, burying them in the tar pits of history. Given the way we're destroying the environment, our species is sowing the seeds of our own destruction. For we humans make decisions to do terrible things. Willful acts of evil at the micro scale of single deeds, a premeditated brutal rape or an unplanned murder in an act of passion, and at the macro level, mass murders, terrorism, genocide, infanticide, gendercide, and on and on. History is riddled with the bones of our readiness to destroy one another, and every advance in technology, no matter how it has potential for good, seems to find ready use and misuse in the hands of monsters. And then there are the random acts of nature, birth defects, a fall, a car accident, a fatal reaction due to a previously undetected allergy, tsunamis, earthquakes, floods, tornadoes. There's collateral evil, a technological error, and a plane crash. Carrying a family on a long anticipated vacation, or a stray bullet in a drive-by shooting finds a toddler. I could go on. You can add to the list. It's a painful one. We know what it's like to live in such a world, at least during the moments in which we are honest about life and allow ourselves to feel all of that. I want to share a song I wrote which expresses something of what it's like, although I originally wrote it based on a creative prompt to create something inspired by anything we saw at the moment. And as such, the lyrics incorporate the titles of novels on a shelf in the room I was in when I was working on that prompt. But the song ended up expressing how it feels, I think, to a certain extent anyway, to live in and contribute to the broken world that I've been describing. I think, appropriately, it's called Troubled Blood.
Troubled blood, silkworm crawling in my brain. Troubled blood, silkworm crawling in my brain. Dressed in silk and satin, I'm alone on this empty outbound train. Troubled blood, hear that cuckoo call my name. Troubled blood, hear that cuckoo call my name. Voices in my head whisper things I hope I never have to explain. Troubled blood, lethal white inside my veins. Troubled blood, lethal white inside my veins. Someday this poison's gonna be the only part of me that will remain. Troubled blood, career of evil left a stain. Troubled blood, career of evil left a stain. And I'm trying to wash it clean, but troubled blood keeps pouring down like rain.
Now, experience one is all about intentionally trying to draw the brokenness of the world into myself, to feel it as my own. But why? Why would I do that? Several episodes back, I suggested the idea that in spite of the evidence, at the very heart of ultimate reality, there is big E empathy, divine empathy. And if that's true, then that is also what I am, in my truest self. And if that is true, then if I cultivate empathy, I become more fully who I am. That's at least one answer to why I would draw all this into myself. Well, let me talk now about experience two, which I will call empathy. Palestine and Israel went to a Chagall exhibition. I have a friend who's a Palestinian Arab Muslim, and we were both invited to South Korea recently to take part in some events. And one day our hosts took us to an exhibition featuring the work of Marc Chagall, a Jewish artist. Chagall's work includes paintings which portray the events of World War II, the Holocaust, the creation of the State of Israel. The latter, of course, is woven through the painful nerve systems currently in place in the region, affecting Arabs and Jews, Palestinians and Israelis. My friend feels these things very keenly, as you might imagine. For him, the conflicts and pain of the present are very real, very personal. But this is what he said to me afterwards when he came out of the venue. I felt I was Jewish. I felt what they've suffered from Egypt, the Nazis. I felt I was them. He thought about their entire history, going back to bondage as slaves, and then to the more recent events under Nazi Germany. What he experienced as he did that was empathy, not as a theory, but as an existential reality inside of him. His experience is an example of empathy in the face of the sort of massive evil I've been trying to welcome in experience one. It changed his way of seeing the other, and the experience gives me hope that empathy, when cultivated and experienced, can make a difference. That's another answer to why for me, a reason to cultivate empathy. But why is that needed to begin with? In episode 26, I suggested the possibility that empathy might be a key feature in the nature of Big C consciousness and of all reality, and then I explored various religious heritages to see what they might say about it. If you've been following the episodes, you know that I found that each religious heritage, with the exception of polytheism, provides at least some support for my thesis. That's not intended to imply that empathy with a big E is central to each religion, but I see evidence of it to some degree in every heritage. And I've just described ways that cultivating empathy can matter, but while it's wonderful that empathy can make a difference, as I asked in the previous episode, why all the blood and pain and grief and sorrow and cruelty to start with? Why is empathy even necessary? Yes, we are still waiting for me to try and answer that nagging question about evil. Why is everything so messed up? And in this episode and the next one, I'm going to look briefly at religious attempts to answer that question and offer my own thoughts about this. But I can tell you now the conclusion that I come to at the end of it all. I really don't know. I have some thoughts and theories and opinions that I think are grounded in everything we've been covering in these episodes. But at the end of the day, I don't know that I have any satisfactory answer. Now, before we talk about religion, let me go back to the soil of the soul again. I'm not sure why, but I feel it's important to get more personal before I go to religious attempts to answer why evil is in the world. I talked about this a little bit earlier while describing experience 1, but I want to say more about what's been happening inside of me during these times of silence when I try to welcome all of that into myself with empathy. I want to ground all of this in the soil of a soul. I've been trying to sink down into empathy, to open myself to feel it in a 360-degree circle. Well, so what is 360-degree empathy then? Let me just run down a list of bullet points here. It includes all of my own pain, suffering, ache, grief, loss, regret, guilt, shame, failure, fear, and more. And I try to do so as specifically and authentically as possible. It means including all of the same that I just listed for as many of my loved ones and dear ones and friends as I can. It means including in my emotions as best I can imagine all of the same for whatever I know or imagine of human history, all of its pain, suffering, ache, grief, loss, regret, guilt, shame, failure, fear, etc. It means including all of it, all of that, for whatever I can imagine to be cosmic history, the sum total of everything. In other words, 360-degree empathy is an openness to feel all the pain of everything and everyone, all the suffering, ache, grief, loss, regret, guilt, shame, failure, fear, and more, and do so as specifically and as authentically as possible. Well, like what? Scenes of myself as a father and husband, son, brother, friend, co-worker float across my memory. Imagined scenes from Nazi prisons, gas chambers, terrified children clinging to the hands of weeping mothers, rail-thin men, uniformed soldiers walking to dining rooms, surrounded by children of their own. Some soldiers whose guilt is screaming inside their souls, ripping the bones of their consciences to tatters, others satisfied in the assurance that they're simply obeying orders. I see a mother, her sweat fresh from labor, cradling a tiny newborn with a misshapen head, a cleft palate, a missing limb, fighting for breath. I see a bear and her cub running in circles surrounded by flame, the circle of heat drawing tighter around them, melting the leaves of the bushes they turn to in a futile search for cover. The fire lit by a careless camper or a random lightning strike. I imagine DNA burning in the cells of a woman, an inner clock ticking down to the timed release of MS. I see ocean levels rising. I breathe toxic air. I hear the screams of a preteen child thrown into a van by men who moments before ripped her arms away from a father whose hand was stuffing money in his pocket as he walked back home to a makeshift tent and 15 sets of eyes staring blank and numbed into the night. I see a boy who went to school in the morning with a black eye, walking home in fear that more is waiting. I see a woman curled around herself, crippled by memories of standing helpless and terrified, hearing the sounds down the hallway. I see headlines, bombings, shootings, rounding up of immigrants, bitter winters without heat, missing children, children found. I see, well, it gives you the idea. This has been my morning practice, allowing myself to, in some way, sink down into all of that, which is the same as allowing it to sink into me. And again, I ask, why do these things happen? Well, are there religious answers? Yes. Religions have given answers, and I want to look at what some of them are. I'm going to go back to the theisms. Monotheism, pantheism, and atheism in this episode, panentheism in the next one. I leave aside polytheism for two reasons. First, polytheism does not seem to have a coherent answer to the question I'm asking, at least so far as I can see. In fact, the gods seem as trapped in polytheistic views as we humans, and I imagine they might have the same questions as I do. And second, I've noticed that polytheism doesn't provide a ground for empathy. And as that's the key component in my question, I don't feel the necessary need to mine it here for answers about empathy in the face of evil. So, monotheism first. I spent most of my religious years as a monotheist in its classic Christian expression. That expression shares much with Judaism and Islam, in that all three tell of a divine being that is all-powerful, all-knowing, just, and merciful. How does that version of the divine respond to the world I've been describing? If God is all-knowing, God knows the agony and terror of each situation and person, and knew, when creating the world, that it would turn out like this. As all-powerful, God can intervene. But God chooses not to. Now, one common rationale offered by monotheistic views is that it's better to have a world in which there's free will, even with all the pain, than a world in which God constantly overrides human freedom. But that seems a bit to me as if I were to say it's better to have a kitchen in which my toddler can cut their hand on a burner of a stove, cut their hand on a knife, or burn their hand on a burner of a stove while I watch, but do not intervene. And it's the rationale I've just described for monotheism suggests that that's a better world to let that toddler have that choice than one in which I intervene and stop. In fact, the monotheistic case is even worse than this, at least in the Bible and the Quran. You need to know that I love the Bible, and I love the Quran. I've steeped my soul in their words. I've pored over their pages, and I've drunk deeply from their wells. But I'm an honest lover, and I see some flaws and faults. One of the most glaring is that not only does God allow the sorts of evil I've been talking about, but in both sets of Scripture, there are cases in which God orders it to be done, and in some cases does it by God's own hand. Sickness, hail, fire and brimstone, men and women and children wiped out, floods, mass killing that in any other context we would label as genocide. I'm going to restate what I said above. As all-powerful, when God sees these sorts of things, God can intervene. However, God seems to choose not to do so. Sometimes God, in fact, causes the very things that create this affront to our moral senses. In fact, there are cases in the texts of the Quran, the Bible, in which it seems to me that we, the reader, have a finer moral sense than the divine being that's being described. So classic monotheism, in my view, or at least for me, cannot provide a satisfactory defense of God as a loving being, an empathetic being, in my terminology, allowing and even doing these things. Now, I know there's all sorts of rationales given. I'm simply stating that none of them have actually satisfied my intellectual and ethical sense of right and wrong. What about pantheism? Pantheism's explanation of evil is, when push comes to shove, since the only reality is the divine, then the suffering and evil that I've imagined, and to a lesser extent experienced, is also divine, actually directly result of divine activity. I'm going to refer to the Bhagavad Gita, even though I know it's simplistic to say that the Gita is a pantheistic text, pure and simple. The reality is much more nuanced for that. However, it is a source of inspiration for views of the divine that are pantheist, and so it is helpful to refer to it here. Just as I love the Bible and the Quran as an honest lover, so too with the Bhagavad Gita. There's so much that I love in the text, so many ways it has helped me spiritually, but does it solve the question of evil? The Gita is set in the context of a battle scene in which one of the main characters, Arjuna, is distraught by having to fight in a setting in which relatives will kill relatives, and all for a cause that he deems ultimately futile. While I find some of the wisdom Krishna offers to Arjuna deeply moving and helpful, one of the core pieces of wisdom that is offered early on is, in essence, don't worry. Those who die in battle will not really be dead. It just seems like it. Yes, there will be bloodshed, agony, grief, and pain, and loss, but these are actually illusions. I realize that there's, I guess, some truth to this, but at the core, it does not take the suffering seriously, not in my mind. But it is in keeping with the pantheistic view of evil. To rephrase what I've said above, pantheism's explanation for evil is that since everything is divine, so too are the events and outcomes that I'm calling evil. So, let me sum up so far. For monotheism, God is apart from all this, is external to the world and to the suffering, knows about it, allows it, could do something to intervene but chooses not to do so, and in fact sometimes commands it to happen or even causes it directly, God's self. In pantheism, God is not apart from what I see as evil, is internal to it all. God is not just allowing it. God is also not just doing evil things or commanding others to do so. The things that I call evil in the world, the things I've been trying to experience, are actually describing the divine nature, the way God acts. This evil stuff is what God is like. Now, at this point, I admit the atheist point of view begins to make a lot of sense. So let me talk about that for a moment. For atheism, there is no divine dimension, of course, to the question of evil, and in some ways that makes it a bit simpler. The only question for atheism in terms of why evil happens is the question of determinacy, meaning, especially in relationship to humans, do we have a choice to be brutal and cruel, or is this simply how we are predetermined to be, programmed by our DNA, as it were? Are our wars, then, just a way that humans work out the process of survival of the fittest, with the suffering along the way just being the detritus of evolution? To be fully honest, in the face of the data in my meditations of these three theisms, if this was all that I was offered, atheism would be the only option I could actually stomach. I'd have to be either an ontological atheist, one who says there's no such thing as God, actually, in essence, there's no being, or what I would call an existential atheist, a practical atheist, one who says if there's a God, and this is the world, and if pantheism and monotheism as described above were my only options, then no thank you, I want nothing to do with you. In a way, it's the viewpoint of a child of abusive parents who cuts off all contact and for all intents and purposes becomes an orphan. Well, what's this like? I find myself unable to accept the explanations offered by pantheism and monotheism in the forms, at least, in which I've presented and summarized them here. And I realize that there are much more nuanced conversations that could be had, but I'm sort of trying to cut to the root of it. And I find it impossible to accept the view of the world that those two theisms offer when it comes to explaining why evil exists. I find myself concluding that if the only other theism available to me were atheism, then I would likely and reluctantly and sadly embrace that conclusion. I say sadly, which inspires me to insert here an attempt, again, to get at the emotional texture of living in a world in which the non-theist or atheist way of seeing things is in fact the way things are. What's it like to live in that world? It's a poem that's, in a way, a description of how it feels to be a human being who can no longer assume one's prior belief systems about a benevolent God who's ultimately in control. It's a poem called St. Patrick. St. Patrick. Part 1. You are silent and still, in a circle of firelight on the cold moor, hills ripped skinless by the whip-tongued wind. Outside the light's frail rim, thin scaled muscles slide, ripple, and slip from holes into the night beneath a graying moon. They spill over stones, drool down ledges, over doorsteps onto fresh swept floors. The mown fields are writhing, nimble poison. The dust paths between crops signed in cursive rings. You left the fire. You returned. They were gone. The night lay silent around you. Your bruised heel left you limping. You could still hear, ear pressed to stone, faint slithers down deep in the dry river's veins. The fire warming your old bones lights a sliver of trembling light on molting skins. Part 2. In my place, in this time, the green walls grow scales. An old road around the mountain is living, sliming, coiling one gasp tighter, the raw core inside. I can hear without strain the scrape and slither down deep where stone is burning river in the green earth's heart. I see you there, back then, gazing into the fountains of your fire where the red ashes ripple the air, send flickering waves to lick at the shore of black surrounding you. Around me is the scrape of scaled bellies, scratching nearer in a fatherless night. I heave cold prayers at a clouded moon and strike match after match, damp matches, on a rain-dripping stone. That closing picture of being alone in a fatherless dark captures for me the emotion, the emotional texture of being in a divineless dark. If that is reality, then this is what it feels like. But, as I said before, these three theisms are not the only options. As Yoda says in Star Wars: The Empire Strikes Back, when Obi-Wan Kenobi says that Luke Skywalker is the last Jedi, the only hope, Yoda says, no, there is another. And in this case, that other is not theism in the form of monotheism or pantheism or atheism, but panentheism. And although I've already admitted that when all is said and done, I will not have good answers, panentheism is the only theism other than atheism that I can embrace in the face of evil, and I do so. But panentheism has its own unique set of issues in this regard, and explaining why this is the theism I can embrace and how I understand it considering the problem of evil will require an episode all of its own. And so I'll tackle that next time.